What if I told you that a quiet maid who earned just $12 an hour would risk everything to save the life of a billionaire who barely knew her name? What if I told you that in 30 seconds this woman would face the most dangerous choice of her life? Would she stay silent like everyone expected? Or would she find her voice when it mattered most? This is the story of Ruby Washington, a woman who proved that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear cleaning uniforms and carry the weight of doing what's right, even when the whole world tells them to look the other way. Get ready, because this story will change how you see courage forever. Ruby Washington had worked as a maid for the Sterling family for 8 long years. She cleaned their massive mansion in Beverly Hills every single day from sunrise to sunset. Her hands were rough from scrubbing floors, her back ached from bending over toilets, and her heart was heavy from being invisible to the people she served. Mrs. Catherine Sterling barely looked at her when she walked by Mr. Richard Sterling. The billionaire tech mogul never even said, "Good morning." Ruby was just part of the furniture to them, something that moved quietly through their home, making everything perfect while they lived their perfect lives. Ruby earned $12 an hour, which was barely enough to pay rent for her tiny apartment in East LA, where she lived with her sick mother and her teenage son, Marcus. She took 3 buses every day to get to work, waking up at 4 in the morning just to arrive by 7. She never complained, never asked for more, never caused trouble because she needed this job more than she needed her pride. Ruby had learned long ago that poor black women like her were supposed to stay quiet, keep their heads down, and be grateful for whatever crumbs they got from rich white families like the Steerings. But everything changed on that cold Tuesday morning. In November, when Ruby arrived at work to find something that would shake her to her very core. She was cleaning the upstairs hallway when she heard angry voices coming from Mr. Sterling's home office. She knew she shouldn't listen, but something in the tone made her freeze. The voices were getting louder, and she could hear Mr. Sterling shouting about money and betrayal. Ruby pressed herself against the wall, trying to make herself even more invisible than usual. That's when she heard a voice that made her blood run cold. It was Marcus Sterling, the boss's younger brother, talking about how Richard had always been the golden child, how Richard had stolen his inheritance, how it was time for Richard to pay. Ruby felt her heart pounding as she realized she was hearing something dangerous, something that could get her fired or worse. But she couldn't move, couldn't breathe as she heard Marcus say the words that would haunt her forever. "The pills will make it look like a heart attack nobody will ever know." Ruby's hands shook as she understood what she was hearing. Richard Sterling's own brother was planning to poison him, and she was the only one who knew the next few days were torture for Ruby. She watched Richard Sterling eat his breakfast every morning, knowing that any day those pills could end up in his coffee. She saw him laugh on the phone with his wife, not knowing his own brother was plotting his death. She wanted to scream, wanted to grab him and tell him to run, but who would believe a poor black maid over a rich white man? Ruby had seen what happened. To people like her who spoke up against people like the Sterlings, they got fired, they got sued, they got their lives destroyed. She thought about her mother who needed expensive medicine. She thought about Marcus, who was finally doing well in school. She thought about the rent that was due next week. If she lost this job, there would be no other job that paid this much. Ruby lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, wondering if staying quiet made her as guilty. As Marcus Sterling, she prayed to God for guidance, but the only answer she got was the sound of her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Ruby had always believed that good people do good things, but now she was learning that sometimes being good meant risking everything you have. On Friday morning, Ruby arrived at work to find the house buzzing with activity. Mrs. Sterling was planning a big dinner party for that evening to celebrate Richard's latest business deal. There would be investors, there would be reporters, there would be important people from all over the city. Ruby watched as the caterer set up the dining room as the florists arranged expensive flowers. As everyone prepared for what might be Richard Sterling's last meal, she saw Marcus Sterling arrive early that afternoon. carrying a small bag that he quickly hid in his jacket. Ruby felt sick to her stomach as she realized tonight was the night Marcus was going to make his move. She tried to work, tried to focus on her cleaning, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her cleaning supplies when Mrs. Sterling asked her to help serve drinks during the cocktail hour. Ruby wanted to say no, wanted to run away, wanted to disappear, but instead she nodded and said, "Yes, ma'am." Just like she always did, Ruby knew that in a few hours she would have to make the biggest decision of her life. The dinner party started at 7, and Ruby found herself in the kitchen helping the caterers prepare drinks and appetizers. The guests were laughing and talking in the dining room, while Ruby worked in the shadows like always. She kept watching the door, waiting for Marcus to make his move. Her heart pounding so hard, she thought everyone could hear it. 8:30. Marcus Sterling walked into the kitchen carrying 2 glasses of wine. He smiled at Ruby, the kind of fake smile rich people give, to help they don't really see, and said, "Ruby, isn't it? Would you mind taking this wine to my brother? He's in his study making some important calls." Ruby looked at the glass of wine and felt her whole world stop. She knew without a doubt that this was it, that the pills were already dissolved in that dark red liquid, that if she carried this glass upstairs, Richard Sterling would be dead within the hour. Marcus was still smiling at her, waiting for her to take the glass like she was just another piece of furniture. He could use. Ruby realized that Marcus had chosen her because he knew she would never say anything, because poor black maids don't speak up against rich white men, because he thought she was invisible. Ruby took the glass with hands that felt like they were made of stone. Ruby climbed the stairs to Richard Sterling's study, feeling like she was walking to her own execution. She could hear him on the phone talking about stock prices and business, deals. Having no idea that death was walking up his stairs in the hands of his maid, Ruby stood outside his door, holding that glass of wine, feeling the weight of 2 lives in her hands, her own life and his. If she knocked on that door and gave him the wine, she would be a murderer. If she didn't give him the wine, she would have to explain why, and then everything would come crashing down. Ruby thought about her mother lying in bed coughing up blood because they couldn't afford the good medicine. She thought about Marcus, her son, who dreamed of going to college. She thought about the tiny apartment that was the only home they had. Ruby had spent her whole life being invisible, being quiet, being grateful for scraps. But standing there outside that door, Ruby Washington realized that some things are more important than being invisible. Some things are worth risking everything for. Ruby took a deep breath, knocked on the door, and waited for Richard Sterling to answer. "Come in," Richard Sterling called out, and Ruby opened the door to find him sitting behind his massive desk, still talking on the phone. He looked up at her, and for the first time in 8 years, he really looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her. Ruby walked across the room and set the glass of wine on his desk. Richard finished his phone call and reached for the glass. Ruby felt time slow down as she watched his hand move toward the wine that would kill him. "Mr. Sterling," she said, and her voice sounded strange and shaky. "Mr. Sterling, don't drink that wine." Richard looked at her with surprise and confusion. "Excuse me, Ruby, what did you say?" Ruby felt her whole body shaking, but she looked him in the eyes and said the words that would change everything. "That wine has poison in it. Your brother Marcus put pills in it to kill you. He wants your money, and he thinks nobody will believe me because I'm just the maid." Richard Sterling stared at her for a long moment, his hand frozen halfway to the wine glass. Then he slowly pushed the glass away from him and asked, "Ruby, are you absolutely sure about this?" Ruby nodded and said, "I heard him talking about it on Tuesday. I've been watching him all week. I saw him put something in that wine downstairs. Mr. Sterling, I know you might not believe me, but I couldn't let you die." Richard Sterling stood up from his desk and walked over to Ruby for the first time in 8 years. He really looked at this woman who cleaned his house, who made his life comfortable, who he had never bothered to see as a real person. "Ruby," he said quietly, "you just saved my life. Do you understand that? You could have said nothing. You could have let this happen, but you chose to save me." Ruby felt tears running down her face as she said, "Mr. Sterling, I know I'm just the maid. I know you probably think I'm lying, but I couldn't live with myself if I let someone hurt you, even if it means I lose my job. Even if it means my family loses everything, I had to do what was right." Richard Sterling did something then that shocked Ruby more than anything that had happened. He reached out and took her hands in his. "Ruby, you are not just the maid. You are the woman who saved my life. You are the woman who chose courage over comfort, who chose truth over safety. I have been blind and selfish, and I am sorry. It took something like this for me to see who you really are." Ruby was crying now, not just from fear, but from relief from being seen, from being heard, from being believed for the first time in her life. The next hour was like something out of a movie. Richard Sterling called the police, and they came to arrest Marcus Sterling, who screamed and denied everything until they found the bottle of heart attack pills in his jacket pocket. The dinner party guests were shocked as they watched Marcus being led away in handcuffs. Mrs. Sterling was crying and asking how this could happen. Richard Sterling stood in front of all those important people and told them exactly what happened. He told them how Ruby Washington, his maid, had risked everything to save his life. He told them how she had shown more courage and honor than anyone he had ever known. He told them that from that day forward, things were going to change. The next morning, Richard Sterling called Ruby into his study again, but this time everything was different. He offered her a job as head of household security with a salary of $60,000 a year. He set up a college fund for her son. Marcus, he paid for her mother's medical treatment. He treated her like family because Ruby had proven that she was willing to risk her family for his Ruby Washington. Learned that sometimes the biggest risk is staying silent, and that's speaking up even when you're scared, even when you might lose. Everything is what separates heroes from bystanders. She learned that being invisible doesn't protect you. It just makes you disappear. But being brave, even when you're terrified, makes you unforgettable. Ruby Washington, the quiet maid who earned $12 an hour, became Ruby Washington, the woman who proved that courage doesn't care about your bank account, your skin color, or your job title. Courage only cares about your heart. But the story doesn't end there, because real change takes time, and Ruby's journey was just beginning. The next few months were harder than Ruby had ever imagined they would be. Even though Richard Sterling had promised to protect her, even though he had given her a better job and more money, the rest of the world wasn't ready to accept that a black maid could be a hero. The other wealthy families in Beverly Hills whispered behind their hands when Ruby walked by. Some of them fired their own maids, worried that their help might be listening to their private conversations too. The local newspaper wrote a story about what happened, but they focused more on Marcus Sterling, the fallen rich man, than on Ruby Washington, the brave woman who saved a life. Ruby found herself famous in a way she never wanted to be famous. Some people called her a hero, but others called her a snitch, a troublemaker, a maid who didn't know her place. Ruby's phone rang day and night with reporters wanting interviews with people, offering her money to tell her story. With strangers calling her names she couldn't repeat to her mother. Ruby realized that doing the right thing doesn't always make life easier. Sometimes it makes life much, much harder. The hardest part wasn't the strangers or the reporters or even the whispers from other rich families. The hardest part was watching her own community turn against her. Some of her neighbors in East LA said she was foolish for risking her job for a rich white man. They said she should have minded her own business, that she had put her family in danger for people who would never care about her. They said she was trying to be white, trying to be better than them, trying to forget where she came from, Ruby's best friend. Maria stopped talking to her because Maria said Ruby thought she was too good for them now that she had money. Ruby felt more alone than she had ever felt in her life, caught between two worlds that didn't seem to want her. She wasn't rich enough for Beverly Hills, and now she wasn't poor enough for East LA either. She had everything and nothing all at the same time. Ruby would lie awake at night wondering if she had made the right choice, wondering if saving Richard. Sterling's life was worth losing her place in the world she had. Always known, Ruby learned that being a hero is lonely work, that standing up for what's right doesn't always get you the happy ending you see in movies. Sometimes it gets you a life that doesn't fit anywhere. Meanwhile, Richard Sterling was going through his own transformation. The attempt on his life had shaken him in ways he never expected. He started looking at his business differently, at his money differently, at the people who worked for him differently. He realized that he had spent 45 years of his life surrounded by people who only cared about his money, including his own brother. He realized that the only person who had truly cared about his life was a woman he had treated like furniture. For 8 years, Richard began visiting Ruby's neighborhood in East LA, not to feel good about himself, but to understand the world she came from. He saw the broken streetlights, the schools that didn't have enough books, the clinics where people waited hours to see a doctor. He saw how hard life was for families like Ruby's, and he started to understand why she had been so scared to speak up. Richard Sterling, who had always believed that poor people were poor because they didn't work hard enough, began to see that some people work 3 times as hard as he ever had just to survive. He started a foundation to help working families get better health care, better education, better chances at life. He named it the Ruby Washington Foundation for Courage and Justice. But Ruby asked him to change the name because she said real. Heroes don't need their names in lights. 6 months after that terrible night, Richard Sterling made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He sold his company for $12 billion and gave away $10 billion of it to help working families across America. He kept $2 billion for his family because he said even rich people deserve to take care of their children. But he said he didn't need more money. Then he could spend in 10 lifetimes. He started working with Ruby to decide which families needed help most. Ruby, who had never graduated from high school, became one of the most important people in American charity work. She traveled the country, meeting families who were struggling, just like she had struggled helping them find hope. Just like Richard had helped her find hope, Ruby discovered that she was good at listening to people, at understanding their problems, at finding solutions that actually worked. She wasn't book smart, but she was life smart, and life smart turned out to be exactly what people needed. Ruby Washington, who had spent 8 years cleaning toilets, now spent her days cleaning up the problems that kept families poor. She learned that there are many ways to save lives, that sometimes saving someone from poison is just the beginning. But success brought new challenges, and Ruby soon discovered that having money doesn't solve all problems. It just gives you different problems to solve. Her son, Marcus, was now 18 and ready for college. But he was angry. Angry that his mother was famous, angry that reporters followed their family, angry that he couldn't just be a normal teenager anymore. He told Ruby that she had ruined their quiet life, that he missed being invisible, that he didn't want to be known as the hero-made son. Marcus started hanging out with the wrong crowd, started skipping school, started talking about dropping out. Ruby realized that saving Richard Sterling had been easy compared to saving her own son from the anger and confusion that comes with sudden change. She spent hours talking to Marcus, trying to help him understand that their new life was a blessing, not a curse. But Marcus couldn't see past his anger. Ruby's mother was also struggling with the changes. She felt guilty about the expensive medicine that now kept her healthy. She worried that Ruby was forgetting where she came from. She missed their old apartment where neighbors were like family, where everyone knew everyone's business, but also cared about everyone's problems. Ruby realized that courage isn't just about one big moment of bravery. It's about the daily choice to keep doing what's right, even when what's right keeps changing, even when your family doesn't understand, even when you don't understand it yourself. The turning point came during the second year after the incident, when Ruby was invited to speak at Marcus's high school during Black History Month. Ruby was nervous because she had never been good at public speaking because she was afraid. The students would think she was just another adult trying to tell them what to do. But when she walked into that auditorium and saw all those young faces looking at her, Ruby felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt like she belonged. She looked at those students and saw herself at their age, invisible, ignored, told that her dreams were too big for someone like her. Ruby started talking, and the words came easier than she expected. She told them about being afraid, about wanting to stay quiet, about almost letting fear win. She told them that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing the right thing anyway. She told them that heroes don't look like people in comic books. They look like regular people who make extraordinary choices when it matters most. Ruby told those students that they all had the power to change someone's life, that they all had something valuable to offer the world, that being poor or black or young didn't mean they couldn't be heroes too. The students listened in complete silence, and when Ruby finished talking, they gave her a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. Marcus, her son, was sitting in the front row with tears in his eyes, and Ruby realized that sometimes the people we're trying to save don't understand. They're being saved until much later. After that speech, everything changed again, but this time, it changed for the better. Marcus apologized to his mother and told her he was proud of her. He said he had been angry because he was scared that their new life would disappear as quickly as it had come. But now he understood that Ruby hadn't just saved Richard Sterling. She had saved their whole family from a life of being invisible. He decided to go to college to study social work so he could help families like theirs. Ruby's mother also came around when she realized that Ruby was using her new position to help people just like them. People who cleaned houses and worked in factories and struggled to pay rent. She said she was proud that her daughter had found her voice and was using it to speak for people who couldn't speak for themselves. The foundation that Richard and Ruby had started together was now helping thousands of families every year, providing scholarships for students like Marcus Healthcare, for mothers like Ruby's mother job training for fathers who had been laid off. Ruby realized that the poisoned wine that almost killed Richard Sterling had actually saved more than just one life. It had saved countless lives by bringing together two people who never would have worked together otherwise 3 years after that night. Ruby Washington stood on the stage at the White House receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest honor a civilian can receive in America. The president said that Ruby had shown the nation what real courage looks like, that she had proven that heroes come from every neighborhood, every job, every walk of life. Ruby wore a simple black dress, not because she couldn't afford something fancy, but because she wanted to remember where she came from. She thought about that scared woman who had carried poisoned wine up the stairs, not knowing if she would have a job the next day. Ruby smiled as she realized how much her life had changed, but also how much she had stayed the same. She was still the same woman who cared about doing what's right. She was still the same woman who would rather lose everything than live with herself. If she stayed quiet when someone needed help, Ruby Washington had learned that being invisible isn't protection. It's just another kind of prison. And that speaking up even when your voice shakes, even when you might lose everything, is the only way to truly live. She had learned that courage is contagious, that when one person finds their voice, it gives permission for others to find theirs too. Ruby Washington, the maid who saved a billionaire, had become Ruby Washington, the woman who taught America that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they carry cleaning supplies and have hearts bigger than their fears. Ruby proved that it doesn't matter where you start in life. What matters is what you choose to do. When life gives you the chance to make a difference, and that everyone gets that chance at least once. And yet, even as Ruby Washington stood on that White House stage with the world applauding her name, she knew deep inside that the true weight of courage is not measured in medals or ceremonies, but in the quiet moments when nobody is watching, when fear whispers that you are too small, too poor, too powerless to make a difference, and still you rise against it because something inside you refuses to be silent. And that was the lesson Ruby carried with her every single day after the cameras turned away, after the headlines faded, because courage was not a one-time act. It was a daily choice, like waking up at 4 in the morning to catch a bus, like scrubbing floors until your knuckles bled, like holding your sick mother's hand in the dark when she thought the medicine would not work, like looking at your son when he was lost in his anger and choosing patience instead of despair. And Ruby realized that this was what had always prepared her for that night with the poisoned wine, that the universe had been shaping her through hardship, teaching her through invisibility, molding her through struggle so that when the moment came, she would have the strength to speak. Even when her voice shook, and she would have the conviction to stand even when the ground beneath her felt like it was breaking apart, and because she spoke, because she refused to let silence when an entire chain of lives were saved lives. She would never even know about children who would go to college because of scholarships, families who would stay healthy because of clinics, parents who would find jobs because of training programs, all because one poor maid decided that her dignity was not for sale and her conscience was not up for negotiation. And the irony that Ruby often thought about late at night when she was too restless to sleep was that she had spent her whole life believing she was invisible, believing her existence was a shadow in someone else's story. But it turned out that her invisibility was her strength because people spoke freely around her, because people never guarded themselves in her presence. And that was why she had been able to hear Marcus Sterling plotting his brother's death. And that was why she had been placed in the exact position to decide whether to be a silent witness or a courageous voice. And when she chose voice over silence, the world tilted forever, and Ruby never stopped marveling at how thin the line was between an ordinary day and a day that changes everything forever. How a single decision in a single moment can ripple outward into generations of transformation. And when she traveled the country, speaking to children and workers and mothers and prisoners, she always told them that they did not need to wait for perfect circumstances to be brave. That courage was not about having money or status or even safety, but about deciding in a split second to protect what is good and true, no matter the cost. And she would say to them, "If a maid who scrubbed toilets for $12 an hour could save a billionaire's life, then you too can save the world in your own way." And people believed her because she did not speak like a politician or a preacher. She spoke like a mother, like a worker, like someone who knew hunger and fear and humiliation. And therefore, her words carried the weight of truth. And as the years passed, Ruby's story spread far beyond America. It reached villages in Africa where women whispered her name around firelight. It reached refugee camps where children imagined themselves as heroes. It reached boardrooms where powerful men were forced to listen to the wisdom of a woman who had once been paid less than their valet. And it reached the hearts of people who had been told all their lives that they did not matter, who suddenly realized that invisibility is not the same as insignificance. And Ruby never asked for this legacy. She never asked to be remembered as a hero. She only wanted to be remembered as a woman who did not betray her own heart. But history has a way of finding its heroes in the most unlikely places. And so Ruby Washington became not only a name in books and documentaries, but a reminder carved into the conscience of a nation that silence kills, but truth saves. And she carried that reminder humbly until the end of her days. Because Ruby did not see herself as extraordinary. She saw herself as ordinary but willing. And that was the difference between a bystander and a hero, between a forgotten maid and a remembered woman. And she often thought about how many other Rubies there were out there, Silent made silent waitresses, silent workers whose lives were dismissed by the rich but who carried the same fire in their hearts, the same capacity to save and transform the world, if only they were given the chance, or if only they dared to take it. And she prayed that her story would awaken them, would remind them that their voices mattered too. And even long after her voice grew weaker and her steps slower, the world never forgot the night Ruby Washington chose to be seen, chose to be heard, chose to change everything with nothing more than a shaking voice and a heart that refused to surrender. Because in the end, Ruby discovered the most powerful truth of all, that courage is not about never feeling fear. It is about feeling fear and still choosing to move forward. And the legacy she left behind was not the foundation, not the scholarships, not even the Medal of Freedom, but the belief planted in millions of hearts that no one is invisible to. God. And no one is powerless when truth is on their side and when Ruby took her final breath. Many years later, her son Marcus, now a man with children of his own, whispered into her ear that she had taught him the meaning of bravery, that she had saved not just a billionaire, but an entire family line from silence and despair. And as her eyes closed for the last time, Ruby knew that the maid who had once been paid $12 an hour had lived a life more valuable than all the fortunes of Beverly Hills, because she had dared to speak when it mattered most.